Welcome to Hear Me Out. I'm your host, Celeste Headley. Independence Day is a massive cause for celebration in this country, and we celebrate revolutions in hindsight. But in practice, when you're living through a revolution, I think, never having lived through one, I imagine that revolution is a lot messier than it appears during our picnics and barbecues and fireworks. Revolutions are very often deadly. They're violent, and the upheaval is often unpopular, both among those in power and those who benefit from the status quo. In past years, we've seen so-called insurrectionists invoke 1776, and leftists declare urban neighborhoods autonomous zones. And across those political lines, those acts have been quashed, often aggressively. So how should we think about uprisers and revolutionaries?
We all know that insurrections can be good. We all know that insurrections have historically gone deeper, reflecting the most oppressed and the most excluded.
Writer and organizer Geo Maher joins us on Hear Me Out in just a moment. Stay with us.
I'm Charlotte Alter, and this is Person of the Week, a new show from Time about the people who shape our world and the forces that shape them. As a senior correspondent for Time, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that to understand our world, you need to understand the people who influence it. So this summer, I'll be having more conversations with the humans behind the headlines, a lot more, and I'm bringing them to you firsthand. Are you ready to meet Time's Person of the Week? Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Hear Me Out. I'm Celeste Headley. We have a complicated relationship with revolution in this country. We are, of course, celebrating the 4th of July this week. And the American Revolution was, of course, a bloody one. And much of the country celebrates it anyway, with red, white, and blue abandoned. But this country has also instigated revolutions in other parts of the world and attempted to stop ones that did not align with our goals. And let's not forget the speech that Frederick Douglass delivered in the mid-19th century when he said, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim." When revolutions and uprisings ferment on our own soil, the status quo is fiercely protected. We've seen that time and time again, instigated by struggles for everything from civil rights to the environment. And the January 6th, 2021 siege on the Capitol was a lot of things. Criminal, fueled by bigotry among them, but it was also an uprising carried out by people who thought they were right. When a group of citizens attempt to overthrow the powers in charge, we either celebrate it or we cast it as shameful, criminal, and reckless. So as we think back on our nation's history this Independence Day, let's also think back on the nature of revolution and insurrection and how our thoughts about revolution change depending on whether the revolution is successful or not. Geo Maher has joined us on this show before. He's a writer and political organizer, and today he joins us to make the case for good faith insurrection as necessary and as righteous. Okay, so the opinion that you bring to us today is that insurrection can be good. So as usual, I got to start with a definition of terms. What qualifies in your mind as an insurrection?
I mean, it's a good question, right? When I think insurrection, I think a sort of an uprising, a mass uprising, an uprising against the system, against an institution, a very sudden thing and momentary thing involving masses of people. But we also need to understand that the way that terms are defined has a sort of historical texture to it. It emerges over time. Words acquire new meanings and gain meanings over time and shift meanings. And this is part of the question. We live in a moment where suddenly the word insurrection is being thrown around in the media all the time. And I admit that I found it a little strange, when it happened, right? When, we're talking about the storming of the Capitol and when insurrection became the term that was chosen, because there are lots of different words that you could choose, for that. And what struck me in a fundamental way was that by focusing on insurrection to describe the events of January 6th, we were really focusing on the form of what happened as opposed to the content. And for me, the content was really the very troubling part, right? We're talking about a sort of white supremacist mob trying to, fight back against not only the institutional transfer of power, but against, if we're thinking about what people, believe and think, against Black Lives Matter, against justice movements, against movements for equality. This was an anti-egalitarian movement, right? This was an a rebellion against justice, right? Which is not always how these things play out historically.
Okay, but what would it mean? You say it was we were focused on form instead of content, and the content you've made very clear. And I feel like if anybody watched what was happening, you could see what the content was. But what's the form that you're talking about?
I mean, historically speaking, we all know that insurrections can be good. We all know that insurrections lay behind almost all sort of revolutionary changes of power. We know that there are insurrections built into U.S. history. There are insurrections built into the French Revolution, the American Revolution. But also even more than that, that insurrections have historically been, gone deeper in the sense of reflecting the resistance from the most oppressed, right, and the most excluded. This isn't an accident, right? It's if you're sort of systematically excluded and invisibilized, the only way you can gain access to power is through a kind of explosive, street protests, direct action, takeovers of, government spaces. And this has historically been the case. Something very interesting happens, though, and here we return to, I think, the historic development of these terms. So at a certain point, it becomes sort of Europeans are doing revolutions, right? They have these ideas of how to change society, forethought, rationality, all these things. Rebellion is what happens in the global South. Rebellion is what slaves do. Insurgency is what slaves do. Insurgency is what, those who are too radical and too unworthy of the name revolution engage in. And this is the way that the historical, question then plays out. And of course, you have slave rebellions, you have anti-colonial insurgencies. And on the one hand, that's a sort of coding. But on the other hand, we want to, I think, uphold that. This is part of fighting against these institutions. Part of fighting against colonialism and fighting against slavery is to rise up.
Okay, but I got to jump in here because fighting against oppression is in the eye of the beholder, right? There have been plenty of insurrections carried out by groups that felt oppressed, but in the end became more violent and autocratic. I mean, even going back centuries to the establishment of the Order of Assassins, which is where we get that word, right? A sect of Shia Islam that took over and became extremely violent. We have insurrections where a group, if you could look at Afghanistan, and would you say that would be called an insurrection that brings in an autocratic religious rule there. I mean, deciding whether an insurrection is in support of the rights of the people, that's an opinion that may not be supported by everybody, right?
In a certain sense, yes. If we understand that insurrection is a mass phenomenon, then there's an origin there. There's a root there. It's not simply something staged necessarily. It's not something where the strings are being pulled from above, except insofar as those strings are pulling on real things, right? Real structures of oppression, real poverty, real degradation, and but none of that is to disagree, right? Of course, insurrection can mean different things, and that's in many ways, what we're talking about in January 6th, right? But again, here's the question, right? The question is one of content. The question is of understanding the fact that if insurrection can, break open the floodgates and help to, usher in greater situations of equality, it has to be tied to, a vision for what that would look like. It has to be tied to an alternative, and it has to be, grounded in those, struggles for justice. In the present, I think it's incredibly important, right? Because the last thing we should do, and this is what struck me so, is so wrong-headed about describing, January the 6th as an insurrection, which is that we ultimately do want insurrectionary movements. We do want people to be willing to rise up against oppression. We do want struggles to embrace the sort of radicalism of those demands and to attempt to transform power, right? Institutions of power are never really willing to transform themselves, right? They always require something that often looks like an insurrection, or at the very least will be described as insurrectionary by those who oppose it.
Okay, but many of the people who participated in the January 6th Riot, whatever you choose to call it, believed they were leading an insurrection. I want to play this bit of audio. This is former President Trump speaking on January 6th from that stage, not far away from the Capitol, talking about, I guess, the motivations behind the violence.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore. And that's what this is all about.
Okay, so I, in no way, shape, or form, am trying to imply that he's correct in his facts. The election was not stolen. It was one of the safest and most secure in history. But the people involved in the uprising, the riot on the 6th, believed that their democracy, many of them believed their democracy was being stolen. And we know that from the court proceedings when they've been prosecuted and they said, I can't believe I believed all that stuff.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely right. But it goes beyond that, right? It goes to this conception of, of who, the sort of ways of thinking that have been built into the American far right for a long time, right? Which go back to the American Revolution, right? Again, it goes back to this idea of there being this sort of safety valve of, when tyranny comes, we have the right to resist, right? Again, I'm not someone that's going to disagree with that, but it's become such an embedded part of the far right that that's actually the entire structure of it, which is to say, who are the oath keepers? They're those who keep an oath to uphold the original, founding of this nation against the tyranny that comes, right? And the 3%ers are those who are brave enough to, to do it and to take on that responsibility. This is the entirety, in a certain way, of the identity of some of these far right groups, and it's very peculiar, right? It's not strictly, what you might expect from a sort of revolutionary or insurrectionary or insurgent force. It's not saying we need to dramatically overhaul and transform in a forward-looking direction what our society looks like. It's a reactionary conservative movement that seeks to, on a certain level, go back to a mythical state of founding of the U.S. What is the content of that? Of course, if we're looking at the sort of original documents, we're talking about embedded in structured white supremacy, free access to land, radical capitalism. These are all the things that carries with it. But it's important to understand the way that they understand themselves to be in a strange, very paradoxical kind of resistance against that very same structure that they claim to be upholding in a different form, right? This is very common in the American far right, and it leads to these kind of waves of rupture where, the majority of the American right wing will be on board with the right wing party of the time, whether it's the Republicans or another, and then in a certain moment will break away. We had this with sort of militia movement, in and after the Reagan era, and you had it with Trump as well. All of these far right movements sweeping into support this person, then becoming kind of disillusioned, and certainly in this case, with the prospect of Trump losing power, mobilized to prevent the tyranny from ultimately taking over. It's a very strange logical construction of the far right, but again, that's the reason that we need to understand, I think, the content, right? We need to understand what that conception of insurrection, even if they were to use the word insurrection, what is it they mean by that? What are they bringing with it, and what are they implying in their sort of claims of outrage and their process for moving forward? It's a return to the past.
So essentially, you're saying insurrections are healthy. Does an insurrection have to be successful in order for you to consider it good and healthy?
Oh, no, certainly not. If anything, if insurrections were really successful, then we would start to call them other things, right? We might start to call them revolutions. We might start to call them in some contexts, guerrilla wars or sort of, other sort of broader frames, right? And what you have historically is that the ways in which insurrections provide a spark, they provide a moment. They also provide an impetus for change, right? There is a way in which you could view the George Floyd rebellions as insurrectionary, right? I mean, I'm not, like that. I think that's a valid interpretation of the fact that where people were in the streets, rebelling, resisting, and demanding that the power structure take their demand, their concerns into account, and essentially saying, listen, we won't be moved otherwise, or there will be more of this otherwise. This is why in the history of sort of Black struggle in the U.S., you have insurgent movements, you have insurrectionary moments, you have people rising up, taking over cities, rebelling, rioting, and making it absolutely clear. Why? Because, as the sort of well-known phrase goes, this is a language of the unheard, right? It's those who are excluded who are pushed into a kind of resistance that moves beyond the official channels by design, right? If you exclude people, if you invisibilize them, if you oppress them to a certain degree, and if you provide them no other alternatives to transform that system, people will take to the streets, and they'll do so in radical ways, whether it's the Boston Tea Party or the storming of the Bastille, right? These are the sort of insurrectionary preludes to more radical claims for transforming power.
So what do you make then of the great activists who have decried any kind of violence when it comes to bringing about change? I mean, you could start with Joan Baez, who said nonviolence is a flop. The only bigger flop is violence. Or you could get a little bit more formal about it and go to Martin Luther King Jr., who said nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time, the need for mankind to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to oppression and violence.
No, it's a great question. I mean, King, though, knew perfectly well that he was operating, especially in the later years, in an insurrectionary moment, right? He knew that and he viewed his task as sort of steering and channeling the discontent that was spilling over into the streets in a way that he hoped could be nonviolent, right? And there are a lot of course, long debates over nonviolence. There are long debates over whether nonviolence ever works in isolation, which is a good question with regard to the civil rights movement. King, the same King who was, of course, decried, as a violent agitator by the U.S. government and its sort of institutions, was very quickly transformed into someone that could, negotiate legislation, and then very quickly after his death turned into a saint, right? This was someone that the U.S. government, the CIA and the FBI hated, right, and saw as himself violent no matter what he did, right, because of the kind of movements that stood behind him. But this all happened in the context of Black Power, right? It happened in the context of insurgent movements, youth movements, riots that were threatening something far more dangerous, right, to the system. And so in those contexts, it's much easier to acquire systemic change, with the threat of what's often referred to in the literature as an armed flank or an insurrectionary flank that is providing a sort of a threat. But there are other questions, right, which is the fact that, violence is so embedded in structures of oppression, domination, colonialism, white supremacy, that it's very difficult to get those systems to give up power voluntarily, right? To give up those privileges without, if not violence, some kind of force, right? The Civil War, was of course an incredibly violent response to a white supremacist institution. And it's really important, I think, to understand that, what equality existed after the Civil War in the South under Reconstruction was made possible by military occupation, right? As soon as that military occupation was withdrawn, we got Jim Crow, we got segregation, we got, the Klan and other kinds of violence against Black people who were simply trying to vote. So nonviolence is an incredibly difficult prospect, although there are situations in which it can be very, very, useful.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I will quote some historians to push back on that idea. We are speaking to Geo Maher about whether insurrection is good. And we will continue this conversation in a moment. You're listening to Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate. I'm Celeste Headley. Stay with us.
From an Iraq war cover-up to towns ravaged by opioids, to the roots of our modern immigration crisis, Embedded explores what's been sealed off and undisclosed. NPR's original investigative podcast reveals why these stories and the people behind them matter. Listen to the Embedded podcast, only from NPR. From an Iraq war cover-up to towns ravaged by opioids, to the roots of our modern immigration crisis, Embedded explores what's been sealed off and undisclosed. NPR's original investigative podcast reveals why these stories and the people behind them matter. Listen to the Embedded podcast, only from NPR.
And we're back. Thanks for staying with us on Hear Me Out. And our spicy opinion of the day, insurrection is a public good. And I'm speaking with Geo Maher, an activist, writer, and a supporter of insurrections in general, if not in specificity. And I want to read you, and I pardon that this is a little bit long, but there's this great book by a couple historians called Why Civil Resistance Works. And they said this: in countries in which violent insurgencies have been victorious, we find, however, that the country is much less likely to become a peaceful democracy after the conflict has ended. On the other hand, in analogous countries where mass nonviolent campaigns have occurred, we see a higher rate of post-conflict democracies. And they say, some may cite the American Revolution against the British as a counterexample. It should be remembered, however, that the armed insurgency against British forces, notably in the form of guerrilla warfare, was preceded by a decade of parallel institution building, nonviolent boycotts, civil disobedience, non-cooperation, and other nation-building methods. Your response, Gio?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot said there that I think is incredibly true, right? Violent civil war and insurgency is incredibly dangerous. It's also very often the way that old institutions are finally, ultimately removed. And the example given there, right, says, ultimately the way you could read that is to say, given all of this nonviolent protest, but again, insurrectionary moments, Boston Tea Party, other things, right? These moments of open rebellion, given all of these in preparation, then a revolutionary war can be carried out and can be victorious, leaving aside other aspects of the American Revolution, the sort of slave-owning aspects, the fact that this was, in many ways, a rebellion of the propertied that sought to sort of maintain those structures. But sticking to that point. Again, there's a lot to be said there, but the implication should never be that the persistence of structures of oppression and domination, even if they persist in sort of relative peace, or if they persist under a sort of formal system of democracy, that's never something that I'm going to sort of point to as a victory, right? And very often what you have are these sort of partial successes, whether it's decolonization or whether it's the abolition of slavery in certain contexts, in which there's no real acquisition of equality and rights, right? And so there's this tendency over time for that resistance, that rebellion, to need to roll on or to be folded into again the kind of like ongoing violence that we see as a result and as the sort of longue durée outcome of white supremacy. There are also very important things to be said for the fact that, fighting for equality and fighting for freedom is incredibly important. Sometimes that looks violent, sometimes it looks nonviolent. But here I think I kind of want to home in a bit on the psychic implications of struggle, right? The fact that people standing up and fighting prepares them for a life in sort of civic and democratic life, right? Again, sometimes that looks violent by necessity, right? If you're fighting a sort of war against, colonialism in Africa, the colonizer is not going anywhere without a fight, right? It's simply a sort of requirement of the struggle. Or whether you're engaging in nonviolent strikes elsewhere, you're standing up. Right. And I think that is a crucial preparatory stage for civic participation. It gives people a sense of equality. It gives them a sense of self-worth that allows them to sort of then be good, good citizens of a new nation and new government.
However, an attempted insurrection is often met by even more authoritarian and a backlash that is equally, if not more violent than before. It can often mean a clamping down on civil rights, and we have seen this over and over and over again. Isn't it true that most insurrections aren't successful? Absolutely, right? Or not successful in the sense of winning victory and winning power. Right. We would probably often call them something different if they were successful. That's absolutely true. Again, we shouldn't blame the oppressed for failing, right, to overthrow their oppressors. But I think, people are very aware of the dangers that these imply, right? We can look even at the history of the Black Panther Party and its sort of perception as an insurrectionary movement and an insurgent movement, of which it was in certain kinds of ways. In the way that it was targeted, right? The way that it was targeted for elimination by the FBI, we know perfectly well. But of course, as a representative of a community that's suffering systematic oppression,
right? Not only, legal oppression, but also extra-legal inequality and ongoing, social questions. The question is how best to fight and how best to win, right? Sometimes that might involve elements of nonviolence, of course, but it also might, by necessity, require, more direct means, violent or not, confrontational or not. And again, to be perfectly clear, the civil rights movement was incredibly confrontational, right? It also involved, and I think this part needs to be told, armed self-defense, right? In other words, the use of arms to keep the movement safe from those who would attack it, destroy it, and kill it. But the tactic of nonviolence was, of course, a major part of certain aspects of that movement as well. And I think we always need to understand that these pieces are coming together in complicated ways, strategic ways. There are disagreements about that strategy. Within those disagreements and even between those different sectors, often we find the grounds for the success or the failure of these movements.
Isn't it possible that a January 6th rioter could excerpt part of this podcast and use it to support their idea of insurrection and say, look, this radical leftist also thinks it was our right to rise up in outrage over the threat to democracy?
I mean, I think, of course, only by radically transforming what we're talking about, right? Because they weren't fighting for equality, right? They weren't fighting for progress. They weren't fighting for a vision of justice, right? They would say that they're fighting for justice, but ultimately, there's no way beyond this sort of ideological standoff, which says that justice for them is justice for white landowning, people in this country to genocide indigenous people, take their land, enslave people, use that labor to build up their own wealth, right? And to oppose any attempt to fight back against that, right? I think luckily we're at a tipping point in this country where where things are going to be able to move very quickly, where the far right is going to be in a period of decline, where people are ready to fight for equality and fight for justice, as we've seen in the streets in these sort of quasi-insurrectionary moments. Again, like there's this phrase, and it always struck me as a very defensive phrase by certain, particularly Democratic politicians, that said, well, Black Lives Matter never stormed the Capitol.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, why not, right? And again, we're not talking about like smashing the windows or necessarily like attacking people. On the one hand, there's a reason that didn't happen. Of course, long histories of oppression cut both ways. But the reality is an insurrectionary Black struggle that is demanding equality, that is demanding actual equality and justice in this moment, and that is demanding sort of reparation for hundreds of years of oppression, past and present. That's a very different equation. That's the kind of movement that, of course, I would support.
When you say you would support it, can you imagine actually participating in an insurrection? Is that as far as you support it, that you would actually become involved?
I mean, we were in the streets, right? We were in the streets in 2020. We were in the streets, in the rebellions, the George Floyd rebellions, which I hope people remember were a massive movement that spread like wildfire across the country and across the world, right? People in England were tearing down statues in Latin America and South Africa and across Europe in response to the bravery that people showed in Minneapolis, which again was a bravery of rebelling, rioting, burning some things down, demanding justice, demanding the arrest of this officer, burning down the police precinct, right? Which it's worth, and I always, emphasize this. When CNN polled people, 54% of those polled said that they thought it was reasonable to burn down the third police precinct in Minneapolis because of the violence that had been inflicted on George Floyd, right? That movement, that rebellion, that insurrectionary wildfire led us to where we are today, which is much more open and frank conversations about injustice. It led even white public opinion to be far more aware of what Black people in particular are going, enduring at the hands of police. And it led to conversations about defunding, transforming the police. All of these things are the result of that insurrectionary moment.
Let me jump in here really quickly, though, because you're talking about violence against property. Mm-hmm. But many of the insurrections you've cited included violence against other people.
Yes, and it's an incredibly important line, right? To draw. For the most part, movements for justice try to avoid unnecessary, violence, unnecessary bloodshed, while drawing a sharp line between, people and property, breaking windows, lighting fires that don't harm anyone are sometimes the most, the most obvious way to get attention for the cause of justice and to move forward on that basis. But again, it's also just historically bad faith to act as if there are no situations in which warfare is the result of struggles for justice, right? Again, slavery didn't go away because of nonviolent struggles. Slavery didn't go away because people voted, right? The whole point was that there was a war required for people to even be able to vote. And even then, that wasn't enough because of the sort of white violence that came in response. So I think we do need to think in a more complicated way about the conditions under which, insurrection can succeed and can lead in the direction of equality and justice.
I think it's also important to note that the Civil War wasn't intended to end slavery. That's not why that war was started.
No, but that's what, when, and this is where the great, W.B. Du Bois, a Black Reconstruction, is so important, because it was slaves themselves walking off plantations, rising up, joining that struggle that made it a war against slavery, and transformed the meaning of the war in the process. But it's absolutely true that wasn't the initial goal. But again, the question was, what would be necessary to preserve equality in the aftermath? And it required federal troops, it required Black militias, and the first thing that reactionary forces and the Klan did was to target Black militias and then to pressure the federal government to withdraw the troops. And again, we got Jim Crow as a result. We got, many decades of, Black codes and systematic legal inequality. We need to understand that, that the struggle for justice takes different forms, I think. And, while these forms raise obvious moral questions and moral quandaries, we need to be aware that the fundamental question is about how do you win justice and how do you move forward with a new system of new institutions that uphold that justice.
Look, we know you have opinions on this topic. We have opinions too, but we want you to share your thoughts with us. Email the show. It's hearmeout@slate.com. And we are still getting emails about our conversation with Coleman Hughes a few weeks ago about whether or not the descendants of enslaved people deserve reparations. We love your passion on this topic. And we want to share a note that we got from a listener named Allison. Allison wrote this: Coleman Hughes presented logical arguments throughout the podcast, but the host did not reciprocate. Whenever Coleman presented an alternative opinion with an example, Celeste would dismiss it with a statement that neither of them were experts in XYZ. Overall, this didn't feel like the productive discussion Celeste kept referring to. I would disagree with that, Allison. I would ask you to go back to the discussion again, mainly because the only times I said that we weren't experts in a specific thing when we were talking about a very specific subject in which Coleman was venturing in to give opinions on something that has been very closely studied and topics on which there are experts who have found answers. But as a journalist, I think it's irresponsible to start entertaining opinions on things that are not based on facts. That's not the kind of conversation we want to have on this podcast. We want to make sure that everything here is an intellectually honest conversation that's based on evidence and facts. But I absolutely welcome your thoughts and respect your opinion. And it sounds like you agreed more with Coleman than with me, and that's okay. If you have thoughts, whether you agree with our guest or not, you are always welcome to email the show. It is hearmeout@slate.com. And we want to take this opportunity to remind you to leave Hear Me Out a great rating and review wherever you are listening. It really does help the show find more ears, and we appreciate it. Hear Me Out is a podcast from Slate. The show is produced by Maura Currie. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations, and Alicia Montgomery is VP of Slate Audio. I'm your host, Celeste Headley. Until next time, speak your mind, but keep it open.
From an Iraq War cover-up to towns ravaged by opioids, to the roots of our modern immigration crisis, Embedded explores what's been sealed off and undisclosed. NPR's original investigative podcast reveals why these stories and the people behind them matter. Listen to the Embedded podcast, only from NPR.